Hello, and welcome to day 10 / part 10 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. Today we're going to go through discovered checks. Now, previously we covered double checks and perpetual checks, but discovered checks have a slightly different property because it's basically a discovered attack with a check, because you'll move a piece, such as a bishop or another piece, that results in a check, and it uncovers or discovers another threat, which either wins material or ends in checkmate. So in this example position, it's white to move, and you can pause the video now if you want. We can see that there's pretty much only two forcing moves. Black has a lot of pressure and is threatening g2, so we need to be aware of that threat, but we have rook check and bishop takes. Now, of course, we can't do bishop takes right away because that would just allow black to take our queen, but we see that if we check with the rook first, that the king has to take. And now that puts him in line on the diagonal where we can take with the bishop, and it actually uncovers an attack on black's queen. Now, because a check is the most forcing, black either has to take it with the rook or the king, and he doesn't have enough time to deal with this threat. And so at the end of the line, we've won a queen for a rook, plus maybe a pawn or two, and it's easily winning. So you can see that when you're evaluating discovered checks, that you want to be able to evaluate the end of the line or how to set them up. So maybe you'll have, for example, this rook check that brings the king into an advantageous position to where you actually have that discovered check. Now, in the initial position, it wasn't set up, but because you'll understand the tactic of discovered checks, you'll be able to set them up in your own games. All right, moving on to position 1. In position 1 here, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. Alright, so this is quite a simple position just to give you some easy practice on discovered checks. Now this one actually results in a checkmate. You can see that pretty much there's bishop here and bishop here, which uncovers the check of the rook on the black king. And we win a piece this way, but you should always look at the multiple possibilities. Of course, we have here as well, but you should notice that if we move here or here with the bishop, that it leaves the flight square for the king. And because he has this dark square weakness, with bishop to f6, we cover the flight square. And because there's no interposition, because the knight or the rook can't move in the way of the white rook, that is checkmate. All right, moving on to position 2. In position 2 here, it is black to move, and you can pause the video now. Alright, so in this position, you should notice that the rook and the king are in line first off, so that should automatically trigger your mind for where you can move this bishop to have the most impact. So, of course, when you're evaluating moves that are attacking the opponent, you want to look for the most forward moves, and that brings to mind bishop takes c2, which actually works. So if the king moves anywhere, we'll just win the queen for a bishop. The queen can come here, and then we basically won the queen for a rook, so that's winning. I just want to point out that there are two double checks here and here. Now, the check here doesn't really work because the king could just move out of the way and it doesn't really result in anything. But notice features that if this pawn wasn't forward, or if we made a double check such as here, then we'd actually get a checkmate. But of course the pawn is moved forward, and so the king could just sidestep it by moving out of the way, and it's not as impactful. Of course, we have this check to win a rook. But you should be totally objective in your valuations of these kinds of checks, because In a game, when you have multiple opportunities of where to move a piece, sometimes you'll find that you move it to the wrong square because you think that the opponent will make a mistake. But of course, you should be totally objective to find that maybe if he made a mistake, you get checkmate, but if you can force the winning of material, then just go with that. Alright, moving on to position 3. In position 3, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. Alright, again, you should notice that there's the bishop and the king in line with a piece in front of it. So you're going to do the same as position 2, where you'll look for where you can move the knight as forward as possible to win the most material. Because of this discovered check, once you move this knight and it's attacking something, unless that attacking piece can get in the way of the bishop, then he'll lose material. Of course, black is threatening this pawn here, but since it's our move, the discovered check will take precedence, and we don't really have to worry about that threat. Of course, we have pawn moves forward here, but that doesn't really solve anything. So pretty much our only candidate moves are knight takes here, and knight here. Now, of course, we should look at the most forward move first. Knight here doesn't really do anything. Of course, we can win that bishop. Knight here can win an exchange. But we should note that because the knight is threatening here, at the end of the line, if we take the bishop here, that he'll win a pawn back. So if knight takes here, because the knight can't interpose, and it's a check, that we've won both the pawn and the knight, and at the end of the line he doesn't have any saving grace to win material back. So the king moves, and we just take the knight, and we've won a piece and a pawn for free. So you see here that, of course, he'll move. We won a bishop, we won a piece, but he wins back a pawn. So of course you want to go with the strongest line, and of course it's knight takes e5 because we win more material. Alright, so moving on to position 4. In position 4 here, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. Alright, so in this position, it's similar to the initial example position because there is no discovered check initially, but the opportunity presents itself when you make a sacrifice. So you see that we can take this pawn here, and we also have queen takes rook check. So you can deduce those candidate moves because those are the only two forcing moves in this position. Of course, after queen takes rook, and the king takes the queen back, it puts the rook and the king in line. Now, of course, once we take the pawn, opening this check, the queen could move in the way, but we would just actually keep our pawn. And so the king is forced to move over out of the check, and we just simply take the queen back, and we're up a rook. Alright, so if you look at the initial position here, you'll notice that a lot of the times discovered checks are forced by a sacrifice. Of course, if you're playing a weaker player, they'll just step into it. But you should always be looking for these kinds of things where if there's a piece or a pawn that you can take, you should see if you can force the king or another piece to step in the way where you could force a check once you take that piece. So it's these kinds of features that when you study these tactical motifs individually, for example, you're studying 5 positions here of discovered checks, it'll put in your mind the pattern recognition of which features lead to which tactics. And of course, you're not looking for those when you're playing the game. You're trying to just do the 4-part thought process, and you're training that overall because you can't keep 30 or 40 or however many different tactical motifs in your head, and you don't want to do that. But what you want to do is you want to train your brain to trigger certain positions in your mind you'll notice automatically when you see them in your own games, such as sacrifice of the queen, pawn takes, and you win material. All right, moving on to the last position, position 5. In position 5, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. All right, so in this position, you can see that black is putting some not too dangerous pressure, but he has an attack on the white king, but we also have our rooks in line with his king, and because of that, it opens up a sacrifice into a tactic. Now we can push the pawn here, but black was threatening here, but we can also just keep pushing it. That's an option. But of course you want to go with the most forcing line. If black has multiple threats and multiple options, then you want to pare that down into the most forcing. So we see that we don't really want to move the knight here because the queen would just check. And we don't really want to move the rook here, so we only have pawn moves forward and queen takes here. Now the queen could take the pawn, but that doesn't really solve anything. So if queen takes the rook, we should always investigate these kinds of tactics, because once the queen, or once the rook and the king are in line after queen takes, then we'll see where we can move this knight. And because this queen is sitting here undefended, we have a discovered check. Now the queen has only here or here to interpose, but it doesn't really solve anything for black, and we've basically just won a rook for nothing. Alright, so in these kinds of positions, again, you're looking for the features of a sacrifice that leads to a discovered check. And this is also training, looking for all the forcing moves. You'd be surprised how far that can take you, because a lot of times these kinds of moves are not hard to see, very simple to see, but you have to have a system that allows you to look for every single opportunity. Alright, this concludes day 10 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.